Welcome, Great Tales, to our Term 3 revision on the nervous system. I'm Yolandi Gibson, a teacher at Parklands College.
And I'm Matric, a teacher at La Rochelle Girls High School in Paarl.
And together we're going to look at a few examples of exam paper questions and just run through the theory very briskly as we approach the questions. Right, so let's dig into this.
Okay, so just a basic overview of the nervous system. You know it's comprised of the central and peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system being the center part, the brain and the spinal cord, where all the integrating functions occur, and peripheral meaning to the sides, so all the nerves that branch from the brain and the spinal cord, the cranial and spinal nerves, creating what is known as the autonomic and somatic nervous system. Autonomic, auto, meaning it by itself on its own. So this system is involved in controlling involuntary actions. So all the effectors within this system will be glands and muscles that you cannot voluntarily control. The somatic nervous system is the effectors that we can voluntarily control, like our skeletal muscle. In terms of the autonomic nervous system, you can see that there are two branches to the system. In fact, all organs that are innervated by the system are innervated in a double way by both of these sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. These two systems work antagonistically, so where the sympathetic nervous system will usually cause a stimulation, the parasympathetic nervous system will try to get back to the original state. So you often learn about the sympathetic nervous system with adrenaline causing that fight or flight response, and then the parasympathetic nervous system causing the rest and recover that happens afterwards. So if we just run through a basic understanding of the brain structures, we have the largest part of the brain, the cerebrum, which has three important functions that you learn of: controlling your voluntary actions, meaning actions that you can control and think and move, interpreting all of your sensations, hearing, tasting, smell, touch, sight, all of that. Different lobes are responsible for different sensations, but we learn the cerebrum as a whole being responsible for interpreting those sensations. And then also in specifically the frontal part of our cerebrum, we have what is known as our higher cognitive processes, like reasoning and memory and judgment being controlled. Then at the back of the brain, the smaller part of the brain called the cerebellum is responsible for basically maintaining balance, muscle tone, equilibrium, and then also coordinating voluntary movement. So where the cerebrum controls and initiates that voluntary action, the cerebellum tries to coordinate which muscles must contract and relax so that you don't fall on your face. Okay. Then we have the corpus callosum, that big yellow part there that connects the two different hemispheres of the brain and actually allows them to communicate with each other. So in this slide, we're actually looking at one half of the brain. Then the hypothalamus you learn about with regards to body temperature regulation, as well as the production of ADH and osmoregulation. It also has some other functions like maintaining blood pressure, sleep rhythms, appetite, thirst, and some emotions. The pituitary gland is the master gland, producing many hormones that we cover in the endocrine lesson. And then another important part, the medulla oblongata, also mentioned in the endocrine revision, is the part where our respiratory center is located, maintaining our breathing and heart rate. And then exiting the foramen magnum of your skull is the spinal cord. Very important to distinguish between the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. The medulla oblongata is that slightly swollen area just below the cerebellum, just before the spinal cord exits the foramen magnum, whereas the spinal cord actually runs through your vertebra in your spinal column.
Okay, so we're going to have a look at a cross-section through the spinal cord, and it's important that we get a visualization of what this image actually is. So imagine someone has taken my body and cut me straight through, right? And then I take my top half of my body off and I put it down and I look into my abdominal cavity. So when I look at my vertebra, I'm seeing a view from the top. Now, if we go to our slide quickly, we can see what that view from the top of our spinal cord would look like. So this whole section here, this is now our spinal cord. Here we've got our nerves that run in and out of our spinal cord. So these will form part of like your peripheral nerves that stretch throughout your body. and they pretty much enter into our spinal cord between our vertebrae, where there will be tiny openings for them to actually start to accumulate, and we eventually have our spinal cord, which is formed. Right, so the spinal cord itself, if we analyze it, as we said, we've got our nerves entering, which will enter through a dorsal root, and the neuron that we find inside our dorsal root will be our sensory neuron. Then we have the main bulk of our spinal cord here. This will consist of two areas, which is known as the white matter and the gray matter area. And usually it receives its name based on appearance. It's actually white in color and gray in color, but it's linked to the cell body, which gives, which is actually like grayish in color. So there's accumulation of cell bodies within the center, while the outer area, that's where the myelinated axon will be located. And that myelin sheath is actually fatty substance, which gives it a white color. Right, so in the center of our spinal cord, we will have our interneuron, and then branching out of it, we will have our motor neuron, which comes out through the ventral root. So this is the spinal cord structure, and it's important to remember that this is also protected very well by layers of membrane, and it's also got cerebrospinal fluid that will protect it. So that ensures that no damage could be done to it, or gives it some form of protection. So when we look at the function of our spinal cord, if we move through our options here, or our functions, it provides a pathway of nerve impulses to and from the brain, and it also serves as a center for reflex actions. So when we talk reflex actions, these are things like you touch a hot stove and you pull your hand away. That's a reflex action. Or if someone comes and they want to poke you in the eye, what do? You close your eyes without even thinking about it. So that is what the spinal cord's job is. It takes the impulses that it receives from the receptors, and it decides how should we respond to it. Should we consult the brain before we make a decision, or is this important enough for us to protect the body and have an immediate rapid response? So then that will be a reflex action. You blink or you pull your hand away from a hot stove without actually having to process it. So if we move to our next slide, that brings us to the two terms that I've used, a reflex arc versus reflex action. So the reflex action is the one that's got to do with quick automatic responses. And the main idea here is that we want to protect the body from harm. So imagine, for instance, you put your hand on that hot stove and you're having a discussion with a friend, for instance, and you're like, something smells, like something seems off. And then only you realize after smelling it, like, oh, I'm actually burning my hand. By that time, you would have had like 2nd or 3rd degree burn wounds. So the idea of our body is to try and take that processing away and then make a decision before you even realize, like, listen, I'm actually in harm's way. I should do something about it. So that is the reflex action. And the word actually says it, action. There's movement involved in it. But when we discuss how a reflex action is brought about, then we are referring to the reflex arc, so the actual steps that it needs to take, or the pathway it needs to take in order to bring about a response. So if we go back to our slide, we can see in this image, there's a little hammer, it hits the guy on his knee, and we didn't think about kicking the doctor. It ended up just happening where we extend our leg. So this action will then be our reflex action. But as we can see in this animated little image, we can see the little stars moving through the neurons, and that indicates the impulse that's traveling through our neurons. Now here we are talking about the reflex arc, which is the pathway along which the nerve impulses, being represented by the stars, are conducted from a receptor to an effector to bring about that reflex action. And in this case, the reflex action would be to actually kick forward. Okay, so let's run through such a reflex action. The action that we have is a pin is pressed into our skin, and we would obviously then pull away from the sharp stimulus, and we now need to look as to how that reflex action was brought about. So in this image, we can see all the neurons being represented here. We've got our spinal cord, we've got our dorsal root here, the ventral root at the bottom. So step by step, if we start off, in order for us to have a reflex action, we first need to be made aware that there's something off. So there will be a receptor that will detect a stimulus. Now, if this is a scenario question in the exam, you actually need to state what that scenario was. And the scenario is that a pin has pricked us, or the skin is being pricked by a pin, whichever way you want to word it, and that will be the stimulus, which is detected by pain receptors located inside our skin. Okay, so the receptor's job is to create an impulse, so it converts the stimulus into an impulse, which will be sent through our sensory neuron. So a sensory neuron will always enter through the dorsal root, and the way in which you're going to identify it is there's a dorsal root ganglion. That's one way to identify this as being the sensory neuron. Or you can identify it by the type of neuron being represented. So this purple structure, that is all part of the sensory neuron, and sensory neurons have their cell bodies that kind of extend out towards the side. So I say it almost looks like a little lollipop that's sticking out from the axon and the dendrite. So this is how I know, okay, I'm working with a sensory neuron, and this is the direction that the impulse is now traveling in. Okay, so the sensory neuron's job is to take that impulse from the receptor to our spinal cord. Then, step 3. At the spinal cord, we now have a little gap between the next neuron, and we refer to that gap as being a synapse. So its function is to actually now take the electrical impulse and release the neurotransmitters, which will bridge across that gap over onto our next neuron, which is the interneuron, and that will allow for that message to continue going. So it's a connection point between two dendrites, not necessarily just between the sensory and the interneuron. We see that same gap here on the other side again, between our interneuron and our motor neuron. Right, so that will be our next part. Then we get to part 4, which is now the interneuron's job. And the word inter should give it away. It's literally in between two neurons. So we've got the sensory neuron and we've got our motor neuron. And the job of the interneuron is literally just to make a U-turn and to send the impulse through a motor neuron out towards our muscles. So yes, impulses will be sent to the brain as well, but its main job is to make a straight U-turn so that we can have a rapid automatic response take place. Okay, then step number 5, we've got our motor neuron, identified by the fact that there are multiple dendrites sticking out from the cell body, which is then sending our impulse down through the ventral root towards our effector, which in this case is going to be a muscle. But let's say, for instance, there was a different scenario. The effector could have also have been a gland, and you would have to state what the effector is in the scenario that has been given to you.
Okay, so let's look at an example of an exam question regarding the central nervous system. They say the diagram below represents the central nervous system in a human. You must first identify parts A, C, and D. So A in the picture is showing us the medulla oblongata. Note that it is that slightly swollen area just below the cerebellum before it exits the foramen magnum. So that would make structure E on our diagram actually the spinal cord. Then C in our diagram is the corpus callosum, which I showed you on that first slide, connecting the two hemispheres, and D is our cerebellum. And then, as I explained, 3 functions of part B, that is our cerebrum. The 3 important functions that you must learn is that it controls all of your voluntary actions. It also helps to interpret all of your sensations, or maybe you said sight, hear, smelling, touching, tasting. And then it's also the place where higher processing functions like reasoning and memory are located. All right. A next question, describe the structure and the function of the autonomic nervous system. So here they awarded 4 marks for any concepts regarding the structure of the autonomic nervous system. Even just saying that we have 2 legs, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems would give you 2 marks, explaining that the sympathetic nervous system actually stimulates responses, the parasympathetic nervous system inhibits it, and talking about the fact that these 2 systems are actually antagonistic, that they work antagonistically controlling involuntary events to bring about, for example, homeostasis. Then we look at a typical reflex arc question like Yolandi just explained. So it shows you a diagram of a reflex arc, they mention it. So that's the pathway that the impulse is going to travel. So the first question asks you to just basically define a reflex action, and you get 2 marks because it's about a fast, rapid, automatic response, meaning automatic, you don't necessarily think about it before it's happening, and that's because we need to protect the body. Then they ask you to label the functional connection at D as well as neuron B. So Yolandi's already explained that in between 2 neurons, even though it might look like they're physically touching, they don't actually touch each other. We have that little junction in between where neurotransmitters are released in order to relay that electrical impulse over the gap and ensure that it travels in one direction only and not backwards. So we refer to a functional connection like this at D as a synapse, and neuron B is neuron B is our interneuron. If you look at the diagram, it's indicating the neuron inside the spinal cord, connecting the sensory and motor pathway with each other. So it's the neuron in between, interneuron. Then they ask you to write down the correct order of the letters of the neurons involved in this reflex arc. Now we know, as Yolandi explained, we take sensory neuron to interneuron to motor neuron, but not all diagrams are equal. So you have to look at what's given to you to try and figure out which one is the interneuron, motor neuron, sensory neuron. Now on this diagram, they've done you a favor. If you look, you see that they've actually indicated with arrows the direction that the impulse is traveling. If you didn't notice that, then you could have looked for that dorsal root ganglion to indicate the sensory neuron. You could also have looked at which neuron is attached to the muscle, because that will be our motor neuron. So the sequence here is just A, B, C. And then they ask you to explain the consequence of a reflex action if neuron C is damaged. So that is our motor neuron. So in instances like this, there are diseases known like motor neuron disease, which literally means that your body is receiving the stimuli because the sensory pathways are intact, but the communication running from the central nervous system to the effector is not working. So the motor neuron is defective. So what we're going to find is that you can actually receive the stimulus, you have the sensation, but you're not able to respond to it. And they could ask this either way. They could ask you what would happen if a sensory pathway was damaged, where in that instance you would not sense the sensation, but you would still be able to perform some other response. So in this scenario, they're giving you 2 marks for this answer, because you would have to say that you would still receive the stimulus. Nothing is wrong with my sensory neuron, nothing happened to my dorsal root, but I'm not able to respond to it because neuron C is a motor neuron that brings about an effect.
Right, for 2.5, they want us to draw a label diagram to represent the structure of neuron A. So if we quickly go back, as we've already established, if we have a little lollipop neuron, that's going to be your sensory neuron that's located at A. So being able to identify the neuron and then draw the correct neuron, that will give you 5 marks. So this is one of those places where they can either ask you to draw sensory neuron or motor neuron, and make sure that you have your labels correct for the different components. So in this image, we've got our lollipop neuron, our sensory neuron. We give it a heading. So the heading would usually give you 1 mark. So a diagram of a sensory neuron. They used to refer to this as being afferent neurons. And I'm sure that some of your textbooks will still explain it as an afferent neuron as well. But our emphasis lately is on the words sensory neuron, motor neuron, and interneuron. And also not referring to the shape of the neuron either. So make sure that you use those 3 words when using or identifying the neurons. Okay, so when it comes to our sensory neuron, the labels that we need to apply would be, for instance, cell body, dendrite, axon, myelin sheath, and those would be the big ones that you would need to then label onto the image. So if we go to our image and look at the mark allocation, they give us 1 mark for that heading as mentioned before, and then any 4 labels. So even if you mess one of the labels up, we're still going to go look for the rest of them. So my hint is always to label the whole complete structure. Don't just limit it to a few. So we're going to start off here. We've got our dendrites, and it goes towards our cell body. From the cell body, we will have our axon that branches to the rest, where we have our axon terminal or terminal buttons, and I mean the list goes on. But here we have our dendrite. The axon runs through the middle of what is known as the myelin sheath that coats it. We've got our nucleus, and then we've got the cytoplasm inside our cell body. So it's important that you ensure that you label all these components, and as I said, any 4 of them will be marked. Okay, in this diagram we have what is known as a motor neuron. So I think M for motor, M for multi. So here we see multiple dendrites sticking out. This is the cell body. Here we've got the axon running down, and we've got the myelin sheath coating it. So if we go to our question 3.1, they ask us to name the type of neuron. So as we stated, it's a motor neuron. They want us to identify parts B, F, and A. So B will be the nucleus, F will be our cytoplasm, and A will be our dendrites. But just to finish off, we also have the axon at C, and we've got the myelin sheath present as well. Right, give the letter and name of the part that transmits impulses away from the cell body. So this is one of those catchy questions or the places where a lot of matrics struggle. And it purely comes down to reading your questions. It is asking us to give the letter and the name of the part, and it's worth 2 marks. And they put in capital letters on the question paper as well, and we tend to sometimes miss it in both cases, and you only give a letter or you only give a name. So yet again, read slowly, highlight your question, make sure that you answer it completely. So for question 3.3a, they want to know transmits the impulses away from the cell body. So as we said, that will be our axon, which is represented by the letter C. For question B, insulates and speeds up the transmission of impulses, and the one that is solely linked to insulation, that's going to be our myelin sheath, which is represented here by D. The node of Ranvier is not labeled nor indicated, so therefore D, myelin sheath, is the only accepted answer for this question. Question 3.4, name the condition by the progressive degeneration of part D, which is the myelin sheath. So in this case, when we talk about progressive degeneration, it means that over time, we find that that myelin sheath is slowly breaking down bit by bit by bit. Degeneration means to break down, and it's a progressive disease. So it gets worse and worse and worse with age. So the disease that we have linked to neuron degeneration, specifically the myelin sheath insulation, that will then be multiple sclerosis. So in grade 12, you need to know about Alzheimer's, which is the brain and the deterioration of the neurons in the brain. And then you need to know about multiple sclerosis, which is the myelin sheath that's breaking apart. And the consequences of multiple sclerosis is that the nerve impulses kind of like leak out. I make the reference, it's like taking a cell phone charger and the plastic's been stripped off the side and the electricity kind of leaks out and your phone no longer wants to charge. And the same thing is kind of happening inside your neurons, where the impulses is no longer reaching the effectors and movement becomes a little bit hampered and progressively gets worse. And especially if it's linked to the respiratory system, eventually the respiratory system will give in when we have multiple sclerosis. But the quickest that we pick it up is that movement becomes a little bit more, what's the word that I could use to explain? Delayed, yeah. It's difficult, yeah. So, and that brings us to the end of our first section of the nervous system, the revision section. We hope that you guys have learned a bit about the nervous system and picked up on areas where you might still need to go back and have another look at it.
We'll see you later.